She had a private jet, a Manhattan penthouse that looked out over Central Park at night like a painting she never had time to stand still and appreciate, and a name that appeared on 4 different Forbes lists before she turned 35. And the moment that cracked her entire life open happened in a gravel lot behind a one-bay auto shop in a town so small it didn't even have a traffic light. Nobody planned it. Nobody could have predicted it. But that's the thing about the moments that matter most. They don't make appointments. They don't send a calendar invite. They show up on a Tuesday afternoon with a busted radiator hose and a wrong turn off Interstate 40, and they change everything. Stay with this story until the end, because the part most people don't know, the part that nobody in that small Tennessee town could have seen coming, is the reason this story matters at all. If you've ever felt like the life you were supposed to want isn't the life that makes you feel alive, this one's for you. And if this is your first time on Crest Stories, hit that subscribe button right now. You don't want to miss what's coming. Wade Rourke had a system. He woke up at 5:45 every morning, not because an alarm told him to, but because his body had learned long ago that the quiet before 6 a.m. was the only quiet he was going to get. He'd stand at the kitchen window of his small house on Birch Creek Road, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Dad," a gag gift from his son the previous Christmas. And he'd look out at the backyard while the sky turned from dark blue to a pale, bruised gray. Then he'd hear it, the soft thump of small feet hitting the floor upstairs, the creak of the third step from the bottom. And then Brody would appear in the kitchen doorway, 8 years old, hair sticking up in 3 different directions, still wearing the dinosaur pajamas he refused to outgrow. "Is there school today?" Brody would ask. Same question. Every morning. "Every weekday, buddy," Wade would answer. Same answer. Every morning. And something about that exchange, that tiny, repetitive, completely unremarkable ritual, was the thing that kept Wade Rourke anchored to the earth. Because without it, he wasn't sure what would. Wade had been running Rourke's auto and repair for 6 years now, ever since he'd bought the shop from old Hank Preble, who was 72 and tired of lying on cold concrete. The shop sat on the edge of Calverton, Tennessee. Population 4,000 and change. A single bay operation with a hand-painted sign out front that had faded from red to a kind of dusty salmon color. Wade kept meaning to repaint it. He never did. There was always a car that needed pulling, always a part that needed ordering, always a school form that needed signing. He had 2 regular employees, a part-time high schooler named Dustin who came in on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and a retired machinist named Floyd who showed up whenever the mood struck him, which was more often than you'd expect for a man with a bad hip, and a strong opinion about every football team in the SEC. The shop didn't make Wade rich, it made him solvent. It paid the mortgage on the little house on Birch Creek Road, kept Brody in sneakers and chicken nuggets, and left just enough at the end of the month that Wade could put a small amount away in an envelope he kept under the workbench in a coffee can labeled Brody College. He never talked about the envelope. He never talked about a lot of things. What people in Calverton knew about Wade Rourke was this: he was honest. He was fair with his labor rates. He showed up to Brody's school events in grease-stained jeans and sat in the tiny chairs in the gym without embarrassment. He brought a covered dish to the church potluck, even though he wasn't particularly religious. He didn't date, didn't complain, and didn't ask for help. What they didn't know, what Wade barely let himself think about, was that 3 years earlier, he'd sat at this same kitchen window and watched a county sheriff's car pull slowly into his driveway. And, in the 45 seconds between seeing those headlights and opening the front door, he'd known. The way you know things that are too terrible to actually know. Anne had been driving back from a conference in Nashville. A deer, a guardrail, a curve in the road that didn't care at all what it cost. Brody had been 5 years old, and Wade had stood in that kitchen doorway and made a silent, terrible decision. He would not fall apart. He could not fall apart. There was a 5-year-old asleep upstairs who still didn't know yet, and that boy needed someone to still be standing in the morning. So Wade stood. He kept standing. 3 years later, he was still standing. He just didn't always know what he was standing for anymore. Beyond Brody. And here's the thing about that. Here's what Wade didn't notice, couldn't notice, because you rarely notice the things that are happening to you slowly. He had stopped expecting anything to change. He had stopped looking at the horizon. He was a man who had pulled his world in very close, made it small and manageable and safe. And somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that small was enough. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. And he definitely didn't know that somewhere on I-40, heading west, a silver Mercedes S-Class with a bad radiator hose was beginning to tell its driver exactly the same thing. Tatum Farwell had not planned to be on that road. She had not planned to be in Tennessee at all, frankly. The original itinerary, confirmed, reconfirmed, and triple-checked by her executive assistant, Preston, had her flying from Nashville back to New York after a 2-day investor conference. Car to the airport, 90-minute flight, car to the office, conference call at 4, dinner with the board chair at 7. That was the plan. The plan died somewhere around mile marker 312. It started as a smell, something sharp and synthetic, like burning plastic mixed with hot metal, that crept into the cabin of the Mercedes even with the climate control set to 68 degrees. Then the temperature gauge began its slow, ominous climb. Tatum noticed it the way she noticed most things that didn't require her immediate attention. She filed it in the back of her mind and kept talking. She was on a call. She was always on a call. The Meridian proposal has to be on my desk before close of business Thursday, Preston. Not Friday. Thursday. Because if Shep Langford's team gets a look at those numbers before we lock our position, we are going to spend the next 6 weeks cleaning up a mess we didn't have to make. The temperature gauge hit the red zone. The Mercedes, with the quiet dignity of a very expensive machine that had been pushed past its limits, let out a sound like a kettle reaching boil, and then exhaled a cloud of white steam from beneath the hood that was visible for half a mile. "Preston," Tatum said, "I'll call you back." She pulled onto the shoulder of the highway with her hazards blinking, got out of the car, looked at the steam billowing from the hood, looked at her cell phone, 2% battery, looked down the empty 2-lane highway in both directions. Nothing. Just flat Tennessee scrubland in the late afternoon heat, the smell of hot asphalt and something definitely burning under that hood, and the particular, specific silence of a place that does not care at all that you are important. She called Preston. The phone died at hello. Tatum Farwell stood on the shoulder of Interstate 40 in a silk blouse and $400 heels, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely no idea what to do next. She started walking. It was 1.5 miles to the exit ramp. She knew this because she'd passed a sign. In those heels, on that gravel shoulder, with the Tennessee sun doing its level best to ruin her afternoon. It took her 26 minutes. She counted, because counting was the only thing keeping her calm. The gas station at the bottom of the ramp had one pump and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Cold drinks, worms, lottery." A teenager behind the counter told her there was one mechanic in town. "Rourke's," he said. "'Bout a mile up Birch Creek Road. Wade'll fix you up." Tatum borrowed the kid's phone charger for 4 minutes, enough to call Preston and leave a voicemail. Then walked back outside, looked at the gravel road stretching away into a stand of trees, and did the only logical thing. She started walking again. She was halfway there when a tow truck came rattling around the bend in the opposite direction, slowed down, and stopped beside her. The driver leaned out the window. He had dark hair, pushed back from his forehead in an unself-conscious way. The kind that came from running a hand through it a dozen times rather than anything deliberate. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a small tear at the collar, and he looked at her with the direct, unhurried eyes of a man who was neither trying to impress her nor intimidate her. "You the one with the Mercedes on the highway?" he asked. "Was it that obvious?" He looked at her heels, then at the gravel road, then back at her face. "Little bit," he said. "Hop in." Now, something about that moment. Because if you asked Tatum Farwell afterward, and someone eventually did, she'd tell you that she climbed into that tow truck fully expecting the next few hours to be an inconvenience, a delay. A story she'd tell at a dinner party someday about the time her car broke down in rural Tennessee, and wasn't it just charming? She was not expecting it to be anything else. But think about what she did in those first 2 minutes in that truck cab. She introduced herself as Tatum, just Tatum, not Tatum Farwell, not the Tatum Farwell, not Farwell Capital's founder and majority shareholder, just a first name. Like she'd pulled off a coat she'd been wearing so long she'd forgotten it was there, and she noticed. Even then, even before she understood what it meant that she'd done it without thinking. Wade didn't ask her last name. He didn't ask what she did, or where she was going, or what she was doing on I-40 in the first place. He said, "I'll get the car," backed up the tow truck with a practiced ease, and went about his business. At the shop, he had the hood up and a diagnosis in under 4 minutes. "Upper radiator hose blew," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Probably a hairline crack that's been spreading. Car this age could have been weeks coming. Hose is toast, coolant's low, and I want to check the overflow tank before I sign off." "How long?" Tatum asked. "Hose I've got, coolant I've got. But I want to order an OEM overflow cap." "Your sensor's reading weird, and I'm not putting a universal on a car this nice and pretending I didn't notice." He looked up at her. "Part'll be here tomorrow morning. I can have you on the road by 10 a.m. Tatum blinked. "Tomorrow," he confirmed without apology. She opened her mouth to say something about the airport, about the flight, about the conference call at 4 and dinner at 7, and the Meridian proposal that needed to be on her desk by Thursday, not Friday. Instead, she said, "Is there somewhere to stay in town?" There was a pause, just a half second, and something moved across Wade Rourke's face that Tatum couldn't quite read. Not pity, not amusement, something quieter than both. "Calverton Motor Inn," he said. "Tell Ruthie at the front desk I sent you. She'll give you the clean room. As opposed to the other room," he said, and left it at that. "Keep watching." Because what happens next, what Tatum sees in the next 12 hours in this town, begins to pull at something she'd buried deep. She'd convinced herself it wasn't there anymore. And there's something about Wade Rourke that she's going to find out much later. Something she wasn't supposed to find out at all. That will make every moment of this story look completely different. The Calverton Motor Inn had 7 rooms, a vending machine that was 2/3 empty, and a front desk run by a woman named Ruthie Kessler, who was 63, had the energy of someone 20 years younger, and told Tatum within the first 3 minutes of meeting her that she'd lived in Calverton her whole life, except for 2 years in Chattanooga that she didn't like to talk about. "Wade sent you," Ruthie said, already reaching for a key with a plastic fob shaped like a little pine tree. "He did. Then you've got room 4. It's got the good mattress and the window faces the garden, which in June is actually something worth looking at." She slid the key across the counter. "You need anything, you knock on that door right there." She pointed at a door behind the desk. "I'm always up." The room was small and clean and smelled faintly of cedar. The garden was, in fact, worth looking at. A wild tangle of black-eyed Susans and something purple that Tatum couldn't name. bordered by a white fence that had been painted and repainted so many times the layers were cracking apart like old geology. She sat on the edge of the bed, plugged her phone into the wall, and in the 90 seconds before it had enough charge to power back on, she did something she could not remember doing in years. She sat in silence, not waiting for the silence to end, just sitting in it. Her phone came back to life with 17 notifications, 4 voicemails, and an email from Preston with a subject line that read, in all capitals, "Tatum, where are you?" She set the phone face down on the nightstand. She went back to looking at the black-eyed Susans. She didn't know why she did it. She wouldn't be able to explain it to Preston, or to her board, or to herself, really, not for a long time. But there was something about the stillness of that room, that garden, that small town going quietly about its evening, that felt like pressure releasing, like the sound a car makes when you finally let off the accelerator after a very long drive. She hadn't let off the accelerator in 15 years. She picked up the phone, sent Preston a message. Car trouble, stuck overnight, I'm fine. Reschedule everything for Thursday. And then, because she was hungry and Ruthie had mentioned a diner 2 blocks over, she put on the flattest shoes she'd brought and walked out into the Calverton evening. The diner was called Patty's, which was honest and straightforward in a way Tatum appreciated without fully knowing why. It had a counter with spinning stools and a row of booths along the window, and it smelled like coffee and something frying in butter, and almost every person in it looked up when she walked in. Not because she was beautiful, though she was the kind of naturally assembled, effortless-looking beauty that made people briefly certain they'd seen her somewhere before. They looked up because Calverton was small and they didn't recognize her. That was the entire reason. In New York, nobody looked up. Nobody noticed anyone. She had walked through entire blocks of that city in a daze and not had a single person's eyes meet hers. Here, a man at the counter touched the brim of his cap. A woman in the second booth nodded. A waitress named Dottie, according to her name tag, arrived at Tatum's elbow with a laminated menu before she'd even found a seat. "Sit anywhere, honey," Dottie said. "Tuesday nights are slow. You'll have your pick." Tatum slid into the booth nearest the window, ordered the meatloaf because Dottie said it was what you ordered if it was your first time at Patty's and you wanted to understand why people came back. And then she looked out the window at the street. She heard them before she saw them. A boy's voice. High and specific, the way kids' voices are when they're telling a story they're deeply invested in. Coming through the diner door. And then Wade Rourke pushing the door open with his shoulder while holding a small paper bag, and next to him, tugging on his sleeve mid-sentence, a boy with dark hair and an enormous gap between his 2 front teeth. And then Miss Aldridge said that the volcano wasn't supposed to explode that much, but Dad, it exploded exactly the right amount. There was just a lot of baking soda involved. "Hey, Brody," because I wanted it to be realistically Brody, and also I wanted it to be the biggest one. Wade looked up from his son and directly across the diner, and his eyes found Tatum in her booth, with the slightly startled accuracy of a man who hadn't expected to see her and wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he had. He gave her a small nod. She gave one back. Brody, who had finally paused to breathe, followed his father's gaze, spotted the stranger in the window booth, and, with the total lack of social filter possessed by 8-year-olds, said loudly, "Hey, is that the lady with the fancy car?" "Brody," Wade said. "It is, isn't it? Can I ask her about it?" "We're going to sit at the counter. But what if she's eating alone?" "That's sad, Dad." There was a pause. Wade rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, in the particular way of a man who was losing a small and daily argument with someone who weighed 60 pounds. He looked over at Tatum. She was, apparently, smiling. She hadn't fully decided to do it, but she was. "You mind," started Please, she said. Brody Rourke talked the way some people breathe, without really thinking about it, with complete commitment, and as though stopping might actually cause some kind of harm. In the 20 minutes it took them to order and receive their food, Tatum learned that his science project had come in second place, but should have come in first, that his favorite dinosaur was the Therizinosaurus because it had the craziest claws of literally any animal ever, that his dad's meatloaf was good, but Patty's meatloaf was also good but different, and that he'd lost a tooth 3 weeks ago, and the tooth fairy had left him a note along with the money, which he considered above and beyond. What did the note say? Tatum asked. Brody glanced at his father with the expression of someone who has been coached on this. That she was impressed I flossed, Brody said. She could tell. Wade, without looking up from his meatloaf, took a sip of his coffee. Tatum looked at Wade, he looked at her. And in that brief, silent exchange, she understood 2 things simultaneously. That he had written that note himself, and that he would never in a million years admit it. She looked back down at her plate before either of them said anything that would embarrass him. This is incredible, she said instead, about the meatloaf. Because it was. Told you? Dottie called from behind the counter without even turning around. They ate. Brody talked. Wade occasionally redirected or edited. And Tatum, who at this exact hour on a normal Tuesday would be deep in a conference call or a board deck or a dinner conversation, where every word was a calculated move, simply ate her meatloaf and listened to an 8-year-old explain at length why the Therizinosaurus was underrated. She could not have told you why it felt like relief. But it did, like the first full breath after a long time underwater. Later, when Brody had finished his pie and was busy drawing something on a paper napkin with a crayon that Dottie had found for him, Wade said quietly, "He doesn't usually talk that much to people he just met." "He seems like a good kid," Tatum said. "He's the best thing I ever did," Wade said, simply, without drama. The way people say true things. There was a pause. Outside, a truck went by on the main street. Somewhere back in the kitchen, something metal clanged. "You said your name was Tatum," Wade said. It wasn't exactly a question. "It is. You from New York?" She looked at him. What gave it away? "The shoes," he said, "and the way you looked at the diner menu like it was a document you needed to review." She laughed. It came out louder than she intended, and Brody looked up from his napkin drawing with satisfaction, as though he'd caused it. "I live in New York," she said. "I'm not sure I'm from anywhere, really." Wade considered this. "That sounds lonely." She opened her mouth to say it wasn't. The words didn't come. "Maybe a little," she said instead. Now here's where you need to pay close attention. Because while Tatum Farwell was sitting in a corner booth at Patty's Diner, learning what meatloaf was supposed to taste like, 70 miles away, in a glass and steel office building in Nashville, a man named Shep Langford was making a phone call. And that phone call was about to start a clock ticking. A clock that Tatum didn't know existed. And a clock that, when it finally ran out, was going to blow a hole right through the middle of everything she and Wade Rourke were just beginning to build. Wade dropped Brody at school at 7:45 the next morning and was back at the shop by 8. He'd been thinking about the car all night. Not about the woman who owned it, or at least, that's what he told himself, the way you tell yourself things that are mostly true. He'd been thinking about the overflow sensor reading, which had nagged at him, and when he'd crawled under the hood at 7 a.m. With his first cup of coffee still in hand, he'd found what he suspected. A hairline fracture in the overflow tank itself, small enough to miss on a quick inspection, serious enough to matter. He ordered the tank too. Called the parts supplier in Knoxville. The part would be there by 11, not 10. He'd have to call her. He picked up the shop phone, put it down, picked it up again. He didn't know what was happening. He'd met a woman. She was passing through. Her car was broken and he was fixing it. That was the whole story, the whole transaction. She'd be on the highway by noon, and he'd be back under someone else's car by 1, and that would be that. He'd told himself some version of this story at regular intervals since the moment she'd slid into that diner booth. He just couldn't quite get himself to believe it. He called the motor in. Ruthie transferred him to room 4. Tatum picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which somehow didn't surprise him. "There's a second part," he said. "Going to be noon, maybe 12:30 before the car's ready." A pause. Then, "That's fine." Another pause, something about it. "You want to come down to the shop," he said. And then immediately questioned why he'd said it. "Sure," she said, with a speed that surprised them both. She showed up 40 minutes later in jeans and a plain white blouse and flats, her hair down instead of pulled back, and looking, he thought, then pushed the thought away. Like someone who had slept well for the first time in a while. She brought 2 cups of coffee from Patty's and handed him one without ceremony, and then she stood at the edge of the bay and watched him work. Most people who waited at the shop either sat in the one-the chair by the door scrolling their phone, or they hovered and asked anxious questions. Tatum did neither. She stood with her coffee and watched with what he could only describe as genuine attention. Like someone who found the actual work interesting. "You want to see what I'm doing?" he said after a few minutes. "I don't want to bother you." "You're not. Come here." He showed her the overflow tank, the hairline crack running along the base, visible only under the work light at a certain angle. He showed her how coolant loss, that slow could go unnoticed for weeks, and why it mattered, and how replacing the hose without replacing the tank would have put her back on the shoulder of I-40, somewhere between here and the Tennessee border. She listened to all of it. Asked 1 or 2 questions that were actually good questions. "How'd you learn all this?" she asked. "My dad," he said. "He had a shop in Kentucky. I grew up in it." "You always wanted to do this?" He thought about it. "I always knew how to do this. That's not exactly the same thing." She looked at him. "What did you want to do?" He picked up a wrench, turned it over in his hands. "I wanted to design them," he said quietly. "Cars. I was pretty good at it, too, for a while. Had a scholarship to the engineering program at UT. He set the wrench down. Life had other plans. He didn't say what the other plans were. She didn't ask, but she filed it away. The way you file away things that feel important before you understand why. The parts arrived at 11:15. Floyd showed up at 11:30, took one look at Tatum, and became immediately and transparently better humored than his usual self. By 12:40, the Mercedes was buttoned up, filled, tested, and running like it had never had a problem in its life. Wade wiped his hands and told her what she owed him. She didn't flinch at the number. She pulled out a card. He named the rate and she looked at him. "That seems low for everything you just did." "That's the rate," he said. She started to say something. He gently cut her off. "Ma'am, that's the rate." She paid the rate. She stood next to the car for a moment, keys in her hand, the engine idling with quiet, restored competence, and she looked at the shop. At the faded hand-painted sign, at the scattered parts and the well-worn tools, at Floyd pretending to check something under another car so he could listen to this conversation. And then she looked at Wade. "Thank you," she said. Not the way people say it when they mean nothing by it. The other way." He nodded once. She got in the car, pulled out of the lot, drove to the end of Birch Creek Road, and stopped. She sat at the stop sign for a full minute, maybe more. She didn't know why. She knew the way. Turn right, 2 miles to the on-ramp, merge west. Simple. She turned left. She drove around Calverton for 45 minutes. The town square, with its small hardware store and its flower shop with the door propped open. The elementary school, where Brody was currently, she imagined, telling someone about therizinosaurs. The little roadside produce stand with hand-lettered signs. The cemetery on the hill, with its old stones going back to the 1800s, names she couldn't read from the car window. She pulled back into the motor inn at 2:15. Ruthie was at the front desk. She looked at Tatum's keys, looked at her face, said nothing for a moment.
"You need the room another night?"
she said finally. Tatum looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Please." She's told Preston it was a personal day. Preston, who had worked for Tatum for 9 years and had seen her work through a root canal, a sprained ankle, and a blizzard that shut down LaGuardia for 2 days, went very quiet on the phone. "A personal day," he said. "Yes, Tatum, Preston. You don't take personal days." "I know," she said. "That's probably relevant information." He was quiet again. She could picture him at his standing desk in the New York office, pinching the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "Everything okay?" he said, and his voice was different now, quieter. "I think so," she said. "I think maybe everything's fine." She paused. "Actually fine, not fine like I'm managing it. Just fine." Another silence, then, "Okay," he said slowly. "I'll reschedule Thursday's calls to Friday." "Thank you." "Preston? Tatum? Yeah. Don't do anything I wouldn't do." "That's an extremely low bar, Preston." She hung up, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled at a phone instead of frowning at it. She walked back to the shop. Wade was under a truck when she got there, just his boots visible, some country station playing on a small radio on the workbench. She sat in the one chair by the door without interrupting him. She didn't know what she was doing here. That was new. Tatum Farwell always knew what she was doing and why. She had been running a company since she was 28, after her father's first heart attack forced a succession plan that was supposed to be 5 years away. She had built Farwell Capital from a regional real estate fund into a multi-sector investment firm with assets in 9 states. She had closed deals at midnight, in hospital waiting rooms, once on a ski lift in Colorado because the service window was tight. She was decisive and deliberate and precise. She sat in a plastic chair in a mechanic's shop in Calverton, Tennessee, and she had no agenda whatsoever. It felt like taking off a 30-pound vest. When Wade rolled out from under the truck, he found her there. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't classify. "Car break down again," he said. "No." "You forget something?" "No." He looked at her another moment. "You hungry?" She realized she was. "Yeah." "Brody gets out at 3:15, he said. "I pick him up. We come back here till Floyd closes up around 5, then I make dinner." He said all of this to the truck, not to her, wiping off his hands. "You're welcome to stay, if you want. I make a decent spaghetti." This was, she would think about later, the bravest thing Wade Rourke had said to another person in 3 years. She didn't know that at the time. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded like it was nothing and went back under the truck. "Pay attention to what happens at the school pickup. Because something shifts there. Something you'll need to hold onto when the stories takes the turn it's about to take." Brody came out of Calverton Elementary in a wave of other kids, backpack bouncing, and spotted the shop truck immediately. He started running. Then he spotted Tatum standing next to his dad by the truck, and he stopped running and started doing a different thing, a kind of exaggerated casual walking that was significantly less subtle than he thought it was. "Hey," he said, arriving at the truck with studied nonchalance. "Hey," Tatum said. "You're still here," Brody observed. "Your car's fixed," he said. Then to his dad, "Her car got fixed, right?" "It got fixed," Wade confirmed. Brody thought about this for a moment with the visible processing of a person who had strong ideas but was choosing his words. Then he looked at Tatum. "Did you just like it here?" he said. Tatum looked down at this 8-year-old with the gap-toothed smiles and the clear, unhurried gaze, and she felt something tighten in her chest. "Yeah," she said, "something like that." Brody nodded, apparently satisfied. "We have good meatloaf," he said. "I know," she said. He climbed into the back of the truck with his backpack. "Dad makes good spaghetti too," he said, buckling himself in. "Not as good as the meatloaf, but still good. And he puts real Parmesan on it, not the canned kind." "I heard," she said. Not from me, Wade muttered, starting the engine. The house on Birch Creek Road was small and unassuming and comfortable in the way of places that are lived in honestly. There were Brody's sneakers by the door, and a half-built model airplane on the coffee table, and a framed photo on the bookshelf that Tatum noticed and then gently did not study. There was a colander that got used, and a good knife on the magnetic strip, and a cast-iron pan that had clearly been cooking for a long time. Wade cooked. Brody did his homework at the kitchen table, mostly, and occasionally asked Tatum for help on a math problem with the easy confidence of someone who decided she was trustworthy. She helped without giving him the answer which he objected to and then appreciated. They ate spaghetti at the kitchen table. Brody had thirds, Wade had seconds. Tatum had 2 helpings and did not think about her nutritionist once. Brody fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock, exhausted in the sudden and total way of children, like a light being switched off. Wade and Tatum sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of dinner and talked for 3 hours. Not about anything big at first. His dad's shop in Kentucky, her father's company in Connecticut, the way both of them had grown up watching someone else work and somehow absorbed it without planning to. Small observations about how certain things feel inevitable in retrospect and random as you're living them. Then, somewhere after 10, when the house was completely quiet and the only light was the one over the kitchen sink, she told him about the year her father got sick, how she'd flown back and forth between New York and Hartford for 7 months, trying to run the company and be a daughter at the same time, and doing neither perfectly. How her father had recovered, mostly, and how by then she'd built a wall of work so high around herself that she couldn't remember how to be on the other side of it. You didn't let anyone in, Wade said. She looked at him. After, he said, not pressing, just naming it. No, she said, I didn't. I know something about that, he said, quiet. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. The clock over the stove ticked. Brody made a small sound in his sleep from the couch. Anne, he said, just the name, carefully. My wife, 3 years ago. I know, she said gently. Ruth Ethy told me a little. He nodded. He wasn't surprised. Small towns. I stopped. He started, stopped, tried again. I made this world for Brody and me, and I made it just the right size, just big enough. No more. Because if it was just the right size, nothing unexpected could fit inside it. She let that sit. And then a woman with a busted radiator hose walks into your parking lot, she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Yeah, he said. Something like that. They sat there for a long time, not talking, in a way that only happens when 2 people have said enough true things that silence doesn't feel threatening anymore. She left at 11, walked back to the motor inn through the warm June night, under a sky she'd forgotten contained that many stars. She did not call Preston. She did not check her email. She sat in room 4 of the Calverton Motor Inn and listened to the night sounds. Crickets, a distant dog, the settling of an old building. And she thought about a man who had made his world just the right size and what it meant that she'd somehow fit inside it anyway. She fell asleep thinking about Brody's homework and the model airplane on the coffee table and a kitchen table where nobody was watching what they said. She didn't check her phone until 7 a.m. There were 41 notifications, 6 from Preston, 2 from her board chair, 1 from a number she didn't recognize, and then there was the news alert. It was a small item from a Nashville real estate trade publication. Business page, not front page. The kind of thing only people inside a certain world would notice. It read, Farwell Capital's Mid-South Portfolio Arm completes acquisition of Calverton Commercial District parcel. Option to purchase remaining Birch Creek corridor properties secured. Tatum sat up straight. She read it again. Then she read it a 3rd time. Her pulse starting to climb in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee she hadn't made yet. She knew the Mid-South portfolio. She had signed off on its general parameters 8 months ago. commercial property acquisitions in undervalued mid-Tennessee markets, targets to be identified and pursued by the portfolio team. She had trusted Preston and the acquisitions lead, a man named Donaldson, to handle the targeting. She had not reviewed the specific parcels. She had not known that Birch Creek corridor properties existed. She had not known that one of the businesses in that corridor was a single-bay auto shop with a faded hand-painted sign. She had not known, but her name was on it. Her company's name was on it. And the option to purchase, the legal mechanism that would allow her company to move on those properties, had been secured 5 days ago. Wade's shop was on the list. She called Preston at 7:02 a.m. Preston, the Mid-South acquisition, Calverton, Tennessee. A beat. "Oh," he said in a tone that told her he already knew. "What properties?" she said. Specifically, she heard him typing. 3 commercial parcels on Birch Creek Road and the surrounding corridor. The auto shop, a hardware store, and 2 vacant lots. The plan is, Tatum, the plan is a mixed-use retail and housing development. It's a good return on the stop, she said. Who approved the option? Donaldson brought it to the board. It was on the consent agenda last month. I didn't review the consent agenda last month. Silence. I was in Singapore, Preston. I know, he said. I should have flagged it. She stood up from the bed, walked to the window. The garden was bright with morning light, the black-eyed Susans almost violent in their yellowness. Does anyone in Calverton know? She asked. Does Wade Rourke know? The notice letters went out 3 days ago, Preston said quietly. Standard certified mail. Preliminary intent to acquire, 30-day response window. She closed her eyes. The letter was probably in his mailbox right now, or had already been pulled from it. She almost left that morning. Almost pointed the silver Mercedes east and drove until the guilt and the complexity and the impossible coincidence of all of it couldn't reach her anymore. She sat in the car in the Motor Inn parking lot for 8 full minutes, with the engine running, her hands on the wheel, arguing with herself. She hadn't known. That was true. She hadn't targeted Wade's shop. That was true. Her company had followed a process that she had approved in general terms without anticipating this specific outcome. All of that was true, and none of it changed what was happening. She turned off the engine, got out, walked to Patty's diner, and ordered coffee. Then she called Donaldson on his direct line. Pull it, she said when he picked up. Tatum, the option on Birch Creek. Pull it. I can't just. There are financial commitments. There's a term, Donaldson. Her voice was very even. I'm asking you to pull it. I'm asking you once more, politely, and then I'm going to instruct legal, directly. And your involvement in this portfolio is going to be revisited when I get back to New York. Are we clear? A very long pause. I'll make some calls, he said. Today, she said. She hung up, drank her coffee, stared at the counter. She still had to tell Wade. That was the part she couldn't strategize around, couldn't hand to a lawyer or a communications team. She had to walk into that shop on Birch Creek Road and tell a man who had cautiously, carefully, with great deliberate effort, allowed her into his small and protected world, that her company had been quietly maneuvering to buy the ground underneath his feet. She ordered a second coffee. Dottie, who seemed to understand that some mornings were not small-talk mornings, just left it on the counter and moved away. She thought about the consent agenda, about Singapore, about the fact that she had built a company so large that its left hand sometimes didn't know what its right hand was doing, about the fact that this was not ignorance, it was distance, the kind of distance you accumulate when you are always moving, always on to the next thing, always managing at altitude and never quite landing. About a man who stayed still, who had chosen one road and walked it with everything he had. She left Patty's at 8:40 and walked to Birch Creek Road. Wade was at the shop when she arrived. He had a letter in his hand. He was standing outside the bay door, looking at it. He hadn't seen her come up the road. She stopped walking about 30 feet away and watched him. His face was still, not angry, or not only angry. It was the face of someone absorbing information that confirmed something they hadn't let themselves be afraid of until it had already arrived. He read it twice. Then he folded it, slowly, along its original crease and tucked it into the back pocket of his jeans. He looked up, saw her. His expression changed, not explosively. That wasn't Wade Rourke's way. But it changed. Something closed. A door she hadn't realized was open until she watched it shut. Farwell Capital, he said. Not a question. She didn't look away. Yes. He was quiet for a very long moment. His jaw was set. His hands, she noticed, were very still. You own it, he said. I founded it. I am the majority shareholder. She paused. I did not know about this property. I didn't plan this. I am telling you the truth. He looked at her, that direct, unhurried look. You were here 2 days. You knew the name of this road. I found out this morning, she said. The acquisition was approved through a board consent agenda while I was traveling. I didn't review the specific parcels. He breathed out through his nose, looked at the shop. So your company decided to buy me out, and you just happened to break down on the highway and spend 2 days having dinner in my kitchen. Yes, she said. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something that would happen in a movie, he said, and not the good kind. 30 feet of gravel between them. The shop sign casting its faded shadow, somewhere abertured she couldn't see. I've already instructed my team to pull the option, she said. As of this morning, before I came here, before I knew whether you'd even found out. He looked at her. That doesn't fix it, he said. I know. This shop is all I've got, he said, and his voice finally cracked open slightly at the edges. Not much, just enough. My kid's school is 5 minutes from here. My house is a mile away. Brody's friends are in this town, He stopped, pressed his mouth into a line, started again. I'm not a portfolio asset. No, she said. You're not. I'm just a mechanic in a small town, Wade. Her voice was very quiet. Look at me. He did. You're a man who wrote a note from the Tooth Fairy, she said. You're a man who makes spaghetti with real Parmesan and lets your kid design science volcanoes that overperform on baking soda. You're a man who noticed a hairline crack in an overflow tank because you were paying attention and you cared. You are not a line item. She let the words sit. I'm so sorry. I am genuinely, completely sorry. His eyes didn't leave her face. The letter was in his back pocket. The shop sign was overhead. You're going to go back to New York, he said finally. It wasn't accusation, it was inventory. And the option is pulled or it isn't, and whether it is or it isn't, you're going to go back. She didn't answer right away, because she had been asking herself the same question since 7 a.m., and she didn't have a clean answer. I have a company, she said. I have. I know, he said. I know you do. Another silence. This one felt different from all the others. Heavier. Can I ask you something? She said. He waited. Last night, she said, at the table, after Brody fell asleep. That was real, right? What we were talking about. That wasn't. Yeah, he said quietly, that was real. She nodded. He nodded. He went back into the shop, not slamming a door, not sending her away. Just going back to work, because there was a car that needed tending, and that was what he knew how to do when things were too large to hold. She stood on the gravel for a long moment. Then she went back to the motor inn and packed her bag. She was on the highway by noon. She called Preston at 12:15 and spent 90 minutes on a series of calls that she had been deferring for 4 days, walking through each one methodically, making decisions, clearing the queue. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was the one thing she had never doubted. She got back to New York at 4:30. Her apartment felt tall and quiet and immaculate in a way that should have felt like coming home, and instead felt like walking into a room that had been staged for someone else. She stood at the window. Central Park below, green and enormous, the city spreading out in every direction in its indifferent magnificence. She thought about the black-eyed Susans in Ruthie's garden. She thought about a framed photo on a bookshelf that she had gently not studied. She opened her laptop and pulled up the Mid-South portfolio file. Read every page of it, every parcel, every assessment, every projected return. Read the analysis that had made Donaldson's team flag Birch Creek Road as a target. She understood their logic. In the abstract, as a piece of financial reasoning, it was sound. A corridor of undervalued commercial property in a town positioned along a future development axis. They weren't wrong about the bones of it. They had just never met the people living in those bones. She called Preston. "I want to fund a small business stabilization program," she said. "Calverton, Tennessee, and the surrounding county. Zero-interest operating loans, 5-year terms, renewable. Targeted at independent businesses on the Birch Creek corridor and similar properties we've been identifying in the Mid-South file." Preston was quiet. "It's not a PR move," she said preemptively. "I don't want press. I don't want the company name on it. Set it up through the family foundation, independent administration. The businesses don't need to know where the funding comes from." "Okay," Preston said carefully. "And the Calverton option, withdrawn, formally. I want the letter delivered by hand, not mail. Done." A pause. "Tatum, are you all right?" She looked at the window, at the park, at the city going about its enormous, crowded, relentless life in every direction. "I'm getting there," she said. She spent the next 2 weeks in New York doing what she always did, managing, deciding, executing. But something was different about the way she did it. Slower, maybe. More deliberate. She started reading the full agenda for board meetings instead of delegating summaries. She started asking her acquisitions team to include photographs of the properties alongside the financial models. She started asking, "Who is here, and what does this place mean to them?" Preston noticed within the first week. He didn't say anything. He just started including more context in his briefings, unprompted. It was on a Wednesday night, 17 days after she'd left Calverton, that she got a text from a number she'd saved and never deleted. It said, "Brody won the science fair." She stared at her phone for a long moment. Then she typed, "The volcano?" A pause, then, "Different project. He built a working anemometer out of paper cups and a pencil." First place. She smiled at the phone. For the second time, at a phone instead of frowning at it, she typed, "He's going to be an engineer." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Yeah, I think he is." She set the phone down, picked it back up, set it down again, picked it up, typed, "I'd like to come back, if that's okay." The pause this time was long enough that she'd convinced herself she'd misread it, that it was too soon, that she had miscalculated. Which was, she realized, the most afraid she'd been in years. Not a deal going wrong, not a board in revolt. The fear that she'd gotten this one specific, irreplaceable thing wrong. Then, Saturday morning, "I'm at the shop." She drove. She didn't fly into Nashville and hire a car. She rented a car in Knoxville, early Friday, and she drove. It took her past small towns and green hills, and the long empty stretches of road that reminded her of the drive down that highway 12 days ago that had seemed like an interruption and turned out to be something else entirely. She got to Calverton on Saturday morning at 8:45. She pulled into the gravel lot of Rourke's Auto and Repair. The faded, hand-painted sign. The one bay door standing open. The radio playing something country that she'd started to find oddly comforting. Floyd's truck in the far corner of the lot, which meant Floyd was somewhere nearby, pretending to do something while monitoring the situation. Wade came out of the bay, wiping his hands on a rag, the way he'd been wiping his hands on a rag the first time she'd ever seen him. Gray t-shirt. Jeans. Hair pushed back from his forehead in that way that was never planned. He stopped when he saw her car. Then he kept walking toward it. She got out. They stood about 10 feet apart on the gravel. You drove, he said. I drove, she said. He looked at the rental car. At her jeans today, not silk, flats, hair down. Brody's at his friend Caleb's till noon, he said. Okay, she said. I have a truck that needs its brake lines looked at. Okay. He tilted his head slightly toward the bay. You want to come watch? She picked up her bag. Yeah, she said. I really do. She followed him into the shop, out of the morning light, into the good smell of grease and metal and work being done honestly. She took the chair by the door. Floyd appeared from behind the truck with a wrench and gave her a nod that contained approximately 47 different editorial opinions, none of which he put into words. Wade got under the truck. The radio played something she didn't know. Outside, a bird, a car going by on Birch Creek Road, the sound of a town going about its Saturday. She sat in the chair, and she didn't look at her phone, and she didn't think about her schedule, and she didn't feel the pull of the next thing or the next meeting or the next version of herself that needed to be somewhere else. She just sat there, still. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't feel like she was between places. She felt like she was in one. They picked up Brody at noon. He came barreling out of Caleb's front door and stopped dead when he saw Tatum standing next to the truck. His face did an extraordinary thing, a rapid sequence of emotions crossing its total transparency, the way only a child's face can. Surprise, recognition, calculation, and then a smile wide enough that the gap in his teeth was front and center. You came back, he said. I came back, she confirmed. He walked up to her with his hands in his pockets, 8 years old and very serious. Did your car break down again, he asked. No, she said. I just wanted to see you guys. He thought about this with the same visible processing as before. Then he looked at his dad. His dad looked at him. Some kind of message passed between them in the way of people who spend a lot of time together. Then Brody looked back at Tatum. We're going to the farmer's market, he said. Dad gets the good tomatoes there. You should come. He paused. If you want. I'd like that, she said. He nodded, started walking toward the truck. Then, without looking back, also, I won the science fair. I heard, she said. The anemometer. He did turn back at that. His eyes cut to his dad, then back to her. He was grinning. He told you, he said. He did, she said. Brody climbed into the back seat. I knew you'd come back, he said, buckling himself in with the matter-of-fact certainty of an 8-year-old who had decided something weeks ago and saw no reason to be dramatic about being right. Wade caught her eye over the roof of the truck. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning was warm, the street was quiet, the sign above the shop was faded but still there. Readable if you looked, like most important things. He opened the passenger door. You hungry, he said. Starving, she said. She got in the truck. Now here's what this story is actually about. Not the romance. Not the billionaire in the small town. Not the coincidence that almost derailed everything. Those are the facts of the story. The events that happened in sequence. What this story is actually about is something harder to name. It's about the particular courage of a man who had closed his world down to a survivable size after a loss too large to survive, and still left the door open, even when he didn't mean to, even when he thought he'd made the world exactly small enough that nothing unexpected could walk in. It's about a woman who had made herself so large, so important, so present in so many places that she had ceased to be fully present in any of them, who had made her world too big to feel and had forgotten, somewhere in the expansion, that the whole reason you build anything is so that you have somewhere to come home to. It's about an 8-year-old who asked a stranger if she wanted to sit with them because being alone at dinner is sad, Dad, and was completely and simply right. Tatum Farwell did not quit her company. She did not move to Calverton. The story didn't end with a bow and a resolution that tied everything into a neat, unconvincing package. Life isn't a consent agenda you can vote on and move past. What happened was slower than that, and realer. She came back on a weekend in July and then again in August. She called more than she planned to. Brody, who had obtained her phone number from his father through methods that were never fully explained, sent her a photograph of the anemometer and says, later, of a second he described as involving something he described, oh, Cruplime, she shared with reaction, which she shared with Freth Preston, that only after confirming that the school had not been evacuated. Donaldson left the company in August. This was his decision, and the timing was not explicitly connected to Calverton. That's what everyone said, and everyone mostly believed it. The Calverton Small Business Stabilization Fund was set up by October. 7 businesses in the corridor received zero-interest loans. None of them knew the source. Ruthie Kessler, who somehow knew everything in Calverton before anyone else did, seemed like she knew. She didn't say anything. She was good at that. Wade repainted the shop sign in September. It was red again. The original color. The color it had been when Hank Preble ran the place. And Brody helped. And there was a picture on the refrigerator of the two of them, covered in red paint, that Tatum had looked at for a long time during her August visit, without saying anything about it. She had asked him, in October, on one of those long after Brody's bedtime kitchen table conversations that had become a thing between them. A real, recurring, anchoring thing. What he thought about the future. He had been quiet for a moment. "I think I'm building something," he said. "I'm just not in as much of a hurry about it as I used to be." A pause. "The engineering thing. I've been doing some reading. There's a program through UT that's online. Part-time." He said it to the table, not to her. "Brody's got 10 years before college. I've got time to build up the business, take on another employee, make the shop run without me covering every hour." Another pause. "I might actually do it." She'd looked at him, at the set of his shoulders, at the quietly determined way he said it, not as a dream, but as a plan. A real one. "You should do it," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I think I might." He looked at her. "What about you?" "I'm building something too," she said. "The company?" "That," she said. "And other things." She met his eyes. "I'm learning how to be in one place at a time. I'm not great at it yet." He smiled. The slow, genuine kind that she'd come to think of as his real smile, the one that wasn't for anyone else's benefit. "You're better at it than you think," he said. There's a moment that Wade told her about, later. Much later, after enough kitchen table conversations and farmers, market Saturdays, and Brody Science Fair victories, that later had to become a place they both lived instead of just a word. He told her that the morning after she'd first arrived at the shop, after the diner, after dropping her at the motor inn, he'd stood at the kitchen window with his coffee mug while Brody was still asleep, and he'd thought, very precisely, don't get interested. Don't let the world get bigger. You made it the right size. Keep it that way. And then Brody had appeared in the doorway in his dinosaur pajamas and asked if there was school today. And Wade had said every weekday, buddy, like always. And then he'd looked back out at the backyard, and the backyard that morning had looked different to him. Not smaller, not larger, just unlocked, somehow, like a door he'd forgotten was a door at all. He couldn't explain what had caused it. He didn't try. He made Brody's breakfast, got him on the school bus, drove to the shop. He just noticed that he was driving a little slower, looking at things a little longer, and he thought, just once, just for a second, maybe the world could be a little bigger and still be safe. That was everything, that 1 second. That one small, quiet, barely there thought. Sometimes the most important moment of your life is the one where you almost don't change your mind, and then you do. If you're watching this story right now and you're in a season where you've made your world small because small is safe, and you can't quite remember when you made that choice, but you know somewhere that you did, this story is for you. And if you're in a season where you've made your world so large that you've lost track of where you actually are inside it, This story is for you too, because the thing that saved both of them wasn't a grand gesture, or a perfect coincidence, or a moment of cinematic clarity. It was smaller than that. It was a busted radiator hose and a borrowed cup of coffee, and an 8-year-old who decided a stranger shouldn't eat alone. It was two people who were willing to sit at a kitchen table after midnight and say a true thing to someone they'd just met. Because the silence felt safe enough to fill, honestly. It was Wade Rourke, standing at his kitchen window on a Wednesday morning, deciding just barely, just for 1 second, to let the world be a little bigger. And Tatum Farwell, sitting in a garden room in a motor inn, setting her phone face down and looking at a tangle of black-eyed Susans for the first time in years. And a boy, gap-toothed and direct and completely certain about therizinosaurs, who looked at a stranger at a diner and said, "That's sad, Dad," and meant it and was right. Some things don't need a Forbes list. Some things don't need a conference call or a consent agenda or a strategic roadmap. Some things just need a door left open and someone willing to walk through it. If this story got to you, if you felt it somewhere real, do something for us right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to Crest Stories if you haven't already. Every story we tell on this channel is for the people who believe that real life, the ordinary, specific, complicated, beautiful real life, is worth telling. Your support makes every one of these stories possible. Leave a comment below and tell us. Have you ever had a moment where something small cracked your world back open? We read every single one. And stay with us, because the next story is already coming, and it might be the one you needed most.